Hey, this is Trey, and you're listening to Us and Them, the podcast that tells the stories about the things that divide us. I first started reporting about our culture wars with stories that focused on education. I looked at battles over textbooks, and classroom content, and what children should and shouldn't be taught. I've looked at debates over reading and science material and ideological showdowns over the content of history books. A few months ago, I heard a really thought-provoking audio documentary from our friends at APM Reports on their Educate podcast. Their report, called The Bond Buster, looks at how we fund public schools. The story focuses on a small Minnesota town. The school superintendent from Worthington walks us through their schools and explains their space crunch. Enrollment is growing, and they just don't have enough facilities and classrooms to meet the needs. So you'd think, well, it must be time to add a new wing to the school or build a whole new facility. The thing is, to build new facilities requires community buy-in. And as we'll hear today, getting that buy-in can often wade into the waters that are filled with us and them issues. Just this month, Worthington did ask voters for more money. This is the 6th time they've done this in just 5 years. And this time, voters said yes to more than $33 million for a new school. The outcome was close. In fact, it just passed by 19 votes. But there's a fascinating story behind that headline. It's the story about how one man led a charge against spending more money for public schools. And in dozens of cases, he's won. But first, let's hear a brief excerpt from APM's Educate podcast. The episode is called The Bond Buster, with reporter and producer Alex Baumhardt.
Financing school buildings is complicated. Ultimately, it boils down to this. When it comes to building new schools or fixing old ones, taxpayers in local school districts pay for almost all of it. Most states cover less than 20% of the cost. 12 states don't cover a dime. The federal government doesn't really give anything unless it's to rebuild after a natural disaster. To pay for construction, most school districts have to take out a loan, then tax every privately owned parcel of real estate in the school district to pay that loan back. But first, they have to ask voters if this is okay. It's called a bond referendum vote. Yes or no on raising property taxes on almost every property owner for the next 20 to 30 years to pay for the school construction. Farmers have a lot of property, but often they don't make much money. The median farm income in this part of Minnesota in 2017 was just over $36,000.
There is no making money anymore in the land, and now you're going to tax us, take out another what we were trying to live on? No.
I want to talk more about this with Alex Baumhardt. She produced the Bond Buster report for APM's Educate podcast series. Alex, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Hey, thank you so much for coming on to the show. So, at the top of our report, we hear you and the superintendent of the Worthington School District, and he's walking you through his schools and showing you how overcrowded they are. Why has there been such an expansion in the student enrollment in Worthington?
In large part because of the ag and meatpacking industries there. So they've had, over the last 10 years especially, a huge influx in immigration from Mexico, Central America, and they've had about 100 new students each year for the last 10 years. And it's largely that community that's kind of kept the town alive.
Yeah, and I want to speak with you a little bit more about that. But I guess I want to know, how long has it been since they've done improvements to the school buildings or built a new school?
They've added space as they needed. So I think they had a failed referendum even several years prior to the series that I cover in this one, which I think was, they're going on 5 in 3 years. 5 bond referendum attempts in 3 years. Before the most recent series, they had a failed referendum. I think the last time they approved school construction was in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was a new elementary school. But other than that, they've basically been building onto existing schools as they need, in large part because they can't get taxpayers to approve an increase in spending, so they just try to reallocate money and spend what they can where they need to.
Aren't people in the community concerned that the facilities that they have, that they don't meet the needs of the students?
Yes, I think there are a lot of parents that are concerned about it. They've seen some outward enrollment from students whose parents say, I don't want my kid going to an overcrowded school anymore. It's also an aging population in Worthington, like a lot of rural communities. It also depends on whether or not you want to give those students more space, whether or not it's important to you, whether or not you have kids in the district or grandkids in the district. For a lot of people in Worthington, that's not the case.
Now, you report that in the last 3 years, there have been 5 school ballot measures, and that voters have turned them all down?
Yes, every time. The last bond vote they had was in February of this 2019, and it failed by... The votes were in the teens. I want to say it failed by like 14 or 17 votes.
So it was pretty slim.
It was pretty slim. It had failed by much more earlier, so the margin's closing.
Alex, I know when things like this happen in my community, there's a bond issue, and they want to build something onto the school or build a new school. And within the community, there's a lot of talk about it. You know, we need this. And then other people say, no, our taxes are too damn high. And there's grumbling from them. But then a vote is taken. And you know, it goes one way or the other. And after that, there's probably still some more grumbling and people's noses are out of joint. But eventually, things kind of settle back down and the community moves on. Do you feel like it's ever gotten to that point, that type of resolution in Worthington?
I don't know that everybody's moved on. And I think there's a lot of hard feelings still. I think there were a lot of people who said, classically, we've disagreed, and we've been able to do it in a way that didn't throw people's character or values or personhood under the bus. But since they've had this consultant, Paul Dorr, involved, a lot of them said that they've felt personally attacked and that those are wounds that will take a long time to heal from.
You mentioned Paul Dorr, and he seems to be the man behind the defeat of these bond initiatives in Worthington. Let's hear a bit more about him from your report, and we'll talk more on the other side.
Sure. Greg Ramo and some other people in Worthington say you can trace the nastiness of this fight back to one guy, Paul Dorr, the man the Worthington Citizens for Progress hired to help them defeat the tax increase. Dorr works as a consultant for a lot of anti-school bond groups. For Dorr, fighting school bond measures isn't just a job, it's a mission.
I have a deep, passionate abhorrence of government schools. I'm dedicating my life to see them and to pass it on, the vision on to my children and children's children, to see that institution one day be gone. That's
Paul Dorr in a YouTube video. He's standing at a podium. Some Bible verses are up on the wall behind him.
I fight these purveyors of the moral destruction of Christianity, that is, the government school. More so, I fight them as I see no biblical warrant for them to even exist.
Paul Dorr wouldn't talk with me for this story. He rarely talks with media nowadays. When I emailed him to ask for an interview, he wrote back that he doesn't support, quote, big government radio programs. He went on to say, such networks promoting leftist ideology and the god of government would simply not exist apart from stealing taxpayer funds from Christians. On his website, he's forthcoming about his personal story and his mission. Dorr comes from a big farming family, but he went into banking. He was co-owner of a small bank in Iowa before he left to do his advocacy work. He started an anti-abortion group called Rescue the Perishing. He's anti-tax and anti-government. He worked as the Iowa field director for Libertarian Ron Paul's 2008 presidential campaign. He works against school bonds through his company Copperhead Consulting. A big part of his work defeating new schools involves trying to convince voters not to trust their local elected officials. Here he is on a podcast called The War Room.
Then along the way, as a former banker, I bring a lot of financial expertise to exposing the illegitimacy of the local government.
He says lots of people trust their local government, and he'd like to change that.
Washington and their state capital are corrupt, but we hope at the local level that we still have some pretty decent people here yet. And it turns out, no, we don't.
Dorr lives in the small town of Ochaden, Iowa. He and his wife raised their 11 kids there, and she homeschooled all of them. He thinks all kids should be homeschooled, or schooled within a community of shared religious belief.
Public education is sin against God. We got to get our kids out.
Dorr's been working with citizens groups to oppose school building campaigns in 9 states for at least 25 years. Besides helping to defeat 24 school building campaigns in his home state of Iowa, he's worked to oppose referendums in Idaho, Illinois, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, South Carolina, South Dakota, and Texas. He claims he's worked against more than 80 referendums in those 9 states. We were able to collect campaign finance records and old newspaper articles that confirm at least 62 of the referendum campaigns he's been involved in. He works primarily in small school districts, many with an area population of less than 15,000 people. In some districts, once the referendums have failed, enrollment has declined. Schools have had to consolidate, and superintendents and school board members quit. And people who've been through the referendum campaigns say when Dorr leaves, he leaves battered relationships behind.
Just the conflict has affected, where parents want to send their kids to school. So it just spilled over to the whole community. And it has been a long, hard process to bring our community back together again.
Paul Dorr tried to rip us apart. Now it's time to mend the fences.
It was very, very draining to the point that, honestly, I had said several times that if it hadn't passed in November, I don't know that I personally could have endured another one.
Alex, it almost seems like he is like a cyclone or a hurricane that hits these towns and communities.
Yeah, I think people in those communities might say the same thing. I'm
curious, how did you find out about the Worthington School District and the mission of Paul Dorr to thwart these public school bond funds?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating town and a fascinating part of Minnesota because for many years this was rural egg, row cropping, livestock, and a lot of these communities were dwindling and, the immigrant communities there have brought life back to these towns. The populations are growing. And in Worthington, it's like just over half the school district is Latino kids. So by virtue of the demographics there, it was a fascinating area. And I was looking at the school district and I was hearing about all the overcrowding issues and could not figure out why they couldn't get a bond passed. And I thought maybe it had to do with the demography. You've got an aging white population, more conservative, and then you have this immigrant community there that's, their kids are making up half the school. And I called a guy named Fred Nolan from the Rural Minnesota Education Association, and we were talking about it, and he just said, "Have you ever heard of Paul Dorr?" And that's when I found out.
The light flashed in your head.
Yeah. I'm like, who is this guy? And Fred Nolan, said he's been working in all these school districts and you had to poke around. And I'm looking on the Worthington Citizens for Progress Facebook page, which is the group that Paul Dorr had been hired to work with in order to defeat the school bond. And, just searching for his name in different states and school districts and all of these newspaper articles from these towns in Iowa and South Dakota and Nebraska are popping up with stories about a school bond and then, a line or a paragraph about controversial consultant Paul Dorr of Copperhead Consulting has been hired by the blank Citizens for Progress or the blank Citizens Acting for Responsible Education. Most of the groups had the same names.
Is it kind of like a title that he uses
Totally.
over and over again?
Oh, yeah. Recycles the names. I found, I was going through all these campaign finance records to just get a clear idea of where he was involved in. In Nebraska, I found these school districts just by searching every one of the names that he uses over and over again in these school districts.
The story Alex Baumhardt tells us in her APM Reports work, called The Bond Buster, is a story about school finance. But it also sheds light on the us and them divisions in communities. Who will pay for better public schools and who will not? And there's another part of the story that's even more complicated. And we'll talk more about that right after this break. I'm Trey Kay, and you're listening to Us and Them, which is produced and distributed by West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX. This show is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
Back now with more of our conversation about the Bond Buster. APM Reports' Alex Baumhardt tells us about a man who has helped defeat dozens of school bond initiatives. This past fall, Paul Doerr worked with residents of Worthington, Minnesota, against a school bond referendum. The ballot measure did pass. Voters approved more than $33 million to build a new school. But the issue goes beyond money. Who's willing to spend more on local schools? You see, in the small Minnesota town of Worthington, a growing population of immigrant workers is changing the demographics of the public schools. Alex, how much of the issue in Worthington focuses on how much race plays into a willingness or not to spend money on local schools? A recent Washington Post article that I read about Worthington suggests that it is an issue.
That Washington Post story, dug into some of the, I think it was Dave Bosma or Don Brink was the kind of central character in that story, and they're...
Don Brink is a bus driver. He's a bus driver who is a Vietnam War veteran.
Yeah.
He opposes the bond issue. He opposes raising taxes, and he's vocal about being bothered by the influx of immigrant children. And yet he's the guy who's ferrying these immigrant children to the schools.
Yeah, he's and he was one of the chairs of the Worthington Citizens for Progress Committee.
Oh.
I showed up at his house and tried to talk with him, and he, kind of shook me off his lawn and said something to the effect of the county is going south and the state's going south, and the government, local government, national government can't be trusted, kind of thing. But the Worthington Citizens for Progress never put anything out into the world that was explicitly racist. And Paul Doerr and the communities he's worked in hasn't put out anything that's explicitly racist. His sort of idea of this world wherein people are getting religious education within a religious community is very segregated. There's absolutely racial tension underlying a lot of things in Worthington. You have that aging white population. You have a new immigrant community.
But I just want to make sure I understand. Why are they coming? Why are they coming to Minnesota?
There's a huge meat packing plant in Worthington called JBS, the Brazilian JBS Swift, Brazilian meat company. And there's tons of hogs in southwest Minnesota. It used to be a lot of poultry. Now it's a lot of hogs and row cropping. So there's plenty of work, especially in the meat industry.
Give us a sense of what the tensions are like in Worthington.
The superintendent there, John Langard, had told me he got calls, from people saying, well, if we just build a wall around Worthington, we won't need to build a new school. Or Lyndon Olson, one of the school board members, he's in his 80s and he's been on the school board for like 15 years. And he's heard, the same things at the county fair. I'm not going to pay for those kids kind of thing. On the other end, you have a lot of families, especially of young kids. I mean, literally anybody I talked to who was like under the age of 45 or even, like 45, they were like, yeah, somebody paid for my school. I get it. I got to pay for theirs. Or, yeah, I've got kids, or my brother's got kids, or my neighbor goes to school. It was like the age difference was so stark. If you were a business owner, I talked to business owners there, they were very much for helping out at the school. It was, by all intents and purposes, this sort of like inner town, middle-aged to younger population that was kind of like, yeah, we need this school. Once you got outside of the town center, out into the farming areas or, some of the areas where you just had the aging population, assisted living, like it was different. You had people on fixed incomes. You have farmers who are feeling financially strapped. And this whole narrative that they are going to be the ones paying for all of these immigrant kids to go to school, and why should they have to do that? So that was kind of the underlying tension. I saw pictures on Facebook, of like farmers putting out these big homemade signs by their cornfields that just said, vote no.
How much is Paul Doerr working from the playbook of, say, Donald Trump?
If anything, that is Paul Doerr's strategy, right? He says it himself. We all have this idea that politics on the national level is corrupt, but we hope our local government is immune to that and we've got good people. And turns out, no, we don't. I think that's really what he wants to serve up, not least of which because that's part of his agenda is let religious communities have control within their own sort of fiefdoms. I think that they called out the newspaper rings true of what's happening on a national level, that all of a sudden, the Daily Globe, which was at a time, it was the first newspaper in the United States to use color photos. It's an institution in that town, and that all of a sudden it was seen as some sort of rag by the anti-school bond folks, speaks to stuff happening at the national level that we hear from President Trump. I don't think any of that helped, not least of which the conversation around immigration, which tends to really exacerbate the us versus them. And if you are a farmer and you don't go into town that frequently or you don't interact with the Latino community that frequently, maybe it makes it even that much easier to create a version of them that reflects what you hear on TV and what you hear from leaders. It's not... At a local level, there are not politicians in Worthington speaking ill about the immigrant community.
I'm wondering how you would characterize the us and them in Worthington. Is it old versus young? Is it longtime resident versus newcomer?
That's a good question. I think the underlying us and them in Worthington, maybe just by virtue of the story and the being so immersed in the financial part of it, is farmers versus everybody else.
Huh.
And I think farmers feel particularly stressed right now in a way that at least in Worthington, it sounded to me like farmers are stressed in a way that makes them feel very alone.
Right.
As that when something bothers them and somebody says, but hey, we all need this, or when something's going to cost them and everybody says, but this is for the future of our town, that they kind of shut down and they're like, you don't know what I'm going through. The Worthington Citizens for Progress was almost entirely farmers. And in Paul Doerr's groups in all of the states he works, they're almost entirely farmers. He reaches out to farmers. And that seemed to me to be the prevailing story in all these towns, is that you get a bunch of farmers together who are like, you all don't know what I'm going through.
Farmers, in many ways, there's so much that they can't control. and that they're often looking to try to take control of the things that they can, if they could just kind of keep the tax pressure down. Is that kind of what you're seeing there? That in this particular situation, this is not a good time for us.
Yeah, I have to believe it's worse now because of the tariffs and also just the agricultural model that they've all been cornered into. But there were boom years where school bonds weren't getting passed in southwest Minnesota and in rural parts of Minnesota. And I think there's probably just some overall anti-tax. I think taxes become the easiest thing to control, or rather the taxes you get to vote on become like a level of, all right, I actually have control over this thing.
Then somebody like Paul Doerr comes along and he actually kind of provides them with a bit more purchase on this control, right?
Oh, yeah. And he's a former banker. So not only that, but they've got a former banker coming in and saying, you all are being robbed, and I know it.
Alex, I was interested in the part of your report where you tracked some criminal charges that were filed against Paul Doerr. And I'd like to hear that part of the report.
I only saw Doerr in person once over this year of reporting. It was in a courtroom in Orange City, Iowa. He had been charged with fifth-degree criminal mischief for burning 4 library books from the Orange City Public Library. All 4 books were LGBTQ positive stories for kids. There was one called Two Boys Kissing, another called Morris Micklewhite and the Tangerine Dress. After he checked the books out, Doerr made a fire in a steel can and filmed himself burning them on a 30-minute Facebook Live video. He read an excerpt from each book, talked about how he felt, and then dropped them in.
Two Boys Kissing, Orange City Library. That one won't be going to the children anymore.
The non-jury trial took place in August, nearly a year after he had burned the books. He was found guilty. He didn't even attempt to defend himself. But right before sentencing, he read something written in the 16th century. It was the last 2 stanzas of the Dutch national anthem.
But unto God, the greatest of majesties, I owe obedience, first and last. For justice, his justice, wills itself. I now turn myself over to your hand.
Doerr was ultimately ordered to pay for the library books and the court fees, in total about $147. Outside of the courtroom, he handed out copies of the anthem he'd read, but he wouldn't talk to me about school bonds. He issued a statement later, saying his motive in burning the books was to protect children and to honor God.
So it seems to me that Paul Doerr is a man with a mission, and that in many ways it doesn't really matter to him what crime society charges him with.
I think he absolutely sees this as a religious mission.
Alex, I remember before the 2016 election, I was having a conversation with a family member who supported Donald Trump. And he wasn't a huge fan of Trump, but he was going to vote for him anyway. And we were talking about how tense and bruising the campaign was, and that we wanted it to be over. And how do you think the people of Worthington can heal after these types of referendums?
I think they want it to be over. I think there are members of the Worthington Citizens for Progress who were against the school bond who have stopped talking to people who could help find a middle ground. The school district, after the second or third failed bond, had put together a task force of people that they knew were against the bond in the previous votes and people that were for it. And they spent a summer trying to come up with a plan and a cost that would make sense to everybody. For a while, the Citizens for Progress were like, if we just get it down to 30 million instead of 35 million. And they came up with a plan and shared it with some of the chairs of the Worthington Citizens for Progress. It seemed like everything was going to fly. Everybody was going to be okay with it. The district added a $5 million option for voters if they wanted to pay for an athletic facility. The Worthington Citizens for Progress said, gloves off, we're back in this. The district is being irresponsible with our money again. And again, it was just a vote. I think the district's like, if you don't want it, vote no. And that was the last time they tried to make a task force, as far as I know. There is a member who was on the Worthington Citizens for Progress who's on the school board now. So hopefully there's some conversation going on there. But yeah, I think people have kind of stopped talking to each other in a way that's productive, where they could get to a place that they both feel good about. And there are some people who, the Worthington Citizens for Progress, I mean, Paul Dorr, it's funny, he goes in and to these school districts, and that's usually a line he'll use, is if we can get it down to this amount, or we're not outright against this, we just want it to be responsible. But that's totally not what he's saying. Like, Paul Dorr's end day mission is zero money. So I don't think anybody's trying that hard to come to a middle ground anymore.
Hey, Alex, I want to thank you so much for creating this thoughtful report and for taking the time to speak with us about it.
Yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this show is me, Trey K, and Kate Smith. Special thanks to American Public Media's Educate podcast for letting us use excerpts from the Bond Buster program. Educate is produced by Alex Baumhardt and Chris Julin. Michael Lipton and Tristam Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The wonderful people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
From PRX.